Hi, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you for being with us here today. I have interesting panelists for you who are experienced in Asia, and they will be able to share with us today where East meets West, where the innovation starts. Can I introduce Jay, who is a partner at Spark Labs Global, Neil Cross, who is the Chief Innovation Officer at DBS Bank, the largest bank in Singapore, Alex Lin, who is the head of Infocom Investments, part of the IDA, Infocom Development Authority in Singapore, and Chua Ki Lok, who is the Group CEO of Vertex Venture, also the largest VC in, can I say Southeast Asia? Yes, Southeast Asia. Great, so I'm going to jump right in and ask the guys to talk. It is a timely moment to talk about Asian innovation. We are in this big hump where everybody is interested in innovation. So startups are emerging in every Asian country. Hackathons are being held every day, every weekend, everywhere. And Silicon Valley money is moving into Asia, and China especially. Corporate accelerators are being formed everywhere. So what are these threats? How do they dovetail into hotspots like Silicon Valley, London, and Berlin? So how is Asia plugged into this world? Jay, a quick introduction of yourself, and would you like to plunge right into the topic of, we know Alibaba and the huge IPO ahead in NASDAQ, but there are very few other Asian tech startups that have also been successful.
Sure. So in terms of introduction, I'm Jay McCarthy. I'm living in Singapore, active in the region, in Asia, moving between China and Hong Kong. I'm a partner at Spark Labs Global Ventures, which is a global group of 6 partners, but we're headquartered out of Korea, wanting to be a little bit different than the average Silicon Valley startup. As for Alibaba, congrats to it, and I'm sure there are many more on the way. I think in terms of the question of why are there not more startups, in my mind, and maybe I'm a little bit biased having lived in Asia for so long, but if life is a curve, whether it's an economy or an ecosystem, Asia's perhaps, in terms of a startup community, a little bit earlier on the curve than Silicon Valley, right? So will there be as many billion-dollar unicorns and plus in Asia as we've seen elsewhere? Sure. In fact, I think Asia's demographic base underpins that there could be a lot more. And if we start at the Alibabas of the world in China in general, we're already seeing this incredible critical mass where not only will they continue growing into an almost endless domestic market, but they could get very active or increasingly active in terms of acquiring overseas successfully. There's been some starts and stops along the way, but it's coming. And even in terms of Southeast Asia, where several of us are from, there's now an official and legitimate market called Southeast Asia, which wasn't the case even in my mind 5 years ago. All the differences of market to market and logistical hurdles and such, but it's being overcome by some pretty dynamic Asian startups. So I do think it's coming. The Silicon Valley is always to be commended. They started this whole thing, but they did have the US market to grow from as a starting platform. Some of the markets we see in Asia are huge domestic audiences. These startups are very busily and increasingly successfully growing into their domestic economies. So by the time they turn around and focus outside their borders, they might have some very serious momentum. There are issues along the way which I can comment on, but maybe you want me to stop there.
Yeah, Alex, we heard this morning at the Asian Innovation Forum that Southeast Asia is a large market with 600 million consumers. However, it's also a fragmented market. So how can a startup, in Southeast Asia or any startup going into Southeast Asia, how do they cope with this fragmentation?
Well, I would say that although the market is fragmented, we look at the ASEAN market as quite a huge big one. It's about 700 million population. But when you start zooming it down, you notice that they have about 80 million consuming households. And the consuming household is where the homogeneity come about. There's some of the startups that we examine, and we are talking to them very closely. Take, for example, one of them is looking after the first-time parents. First-time parents, most of the time, being guys, we think that the first-time parents are always only interested in children education. But the more we drew into that, we're looking at data, then we realize that There's a huge group of them, the homogeneity is down there. Malaysia having the youngest mother is about 27 years old on the average, and Singapore having the oldest one, 30 years old. So it's very, very close by. And their concerns are almost homogeneous. First of all, they worry about freckle on their skin. The second one, stretch mark. And the third, then it comes to children education. Now, because of that, once we identify, we realize that the homogeneity is down there. Chanel is making a very, very good so-called product sales down there without doing advertisement. But they're having one of the most effective freckle cream as well as stretch mark remover thing. So by looking at that, we realize that although the market is fragmented, but the ability to start identifying all these commonality become very important.
What about the language and the cultural diversity?
There is an issue to start with because look at ASEAN, you are 10 countries. 10 countries, 10 languages, 10 rules and everything. But with ASEAN economic community, all these things are slowly unified. For most of the people who are doing trading, you realize that the common language is still English. And the command of English, although it's very uneven, but most of the people are able to communicate. So that helped a lot.
Right, Kilok, we talk about Asian innovation, but many of these startups we see kind of disruptive only in the e-commerce and the sharing economy sphere. Is there really disruptive technology coming up from Asian startups?
Generally, I think Asia startups are, you can group them into three categories. China will be one group, India will be one group, and Southeast Asia will be another group. Of course, I'm ignoring Japan and Korea for now because it's another long conversation. But in those three groups, you know that the startups in those three categories, there's a lot of companies that are disrupting their own market. They may not be creating disruption outside the market, but they are creating disruption within their market. You look at WeChat, how WeChat has been disrupted the whole market in China. Look at India, some of these things like, even though Snapdeal, people have doubts about their profitability, but they are disrupting the traditional retail channel. In Southeast Asia, Grab Taxi is creating a disruption in the transportation systems. So within the startups, they actually are creating their own disruptions.
Right. Neil, we talk about all of this innovation, but you're the Chief Innovation Officer of the bank. So how are banks, jumping on this innovation bandwagon? What help is it to you?
Certainly. I mean, you look at Asia, and I know I'm probably going to annoy most people in the room, that London positioned itself as the world fintech hub. No, China is where it's happening. I mean, China alone, there's over 10,000 peer-to-peer payment startups. Over 10,000. Yeah, the world's biggest fintechs are out of China, Ant Financial. The scale they have is terrifying. The fact that Alibaba is worth, I don't know, their money market fund's worth, I don't know, 150 billion US, makes them the third biggest fund on the planet. They can sweep up 250 million customers. That makes them actually the biggest bank on the planet by customer size. And so, we're sat in Singapore, so one side we've got China causing huge disruption, trying to move into the rest of Southeast Asia. We've got India rising, we've got China investing in India investing in Africa, India investing in Indonesia, China investing in Indonesia, Singapore investing everywhere. And so we really feel the pressure of how financial services is being disrupted. So a lot of the work we do is not so much working with startups to try and get their product or get some equity and that kind of stuff. It's actually how do we utilize startups and help build an ecosystem where bank staff can spend time with startups, learn the tooling, the philosophy, the processes they use, and actually change the bank a lot more than focus on just get a new product or a bit of equity out of the thing. And so for us, we have to do a lot of development. I was in Taiwan last weekend. We ran Taiwan's first banking hackathon, for example. And so now we're putting a lot of energy, staff, and funding into developing that ecosystem. And so a lot of the work we do is really about ecosystem development and then big culture change inside our organization. And startups find it a lot easier to work with us as a bank than other corporates through that.
Right, thanks. Jay, coming back to China, I meet many startups coming to Singapore and wanting to expand to Asia. And they tell me, do we go to China or do we go to Hong Kong to China? So what's your idea here?
Sure. You know, with a lot of these questions about is Asia going to have more successful global startups, and this question in particular, because it's very actively talked about out there, you know, these issues or questions have a longer shelf life, I think, than they should. In my mind, very distinctly today, hard to argue this, if you want to do China, you go do China. Hong Kong is no longer a leap pad into China. There are companies who I think have targeted Hong Kong as their starting point and are thinking of getting to China, but everybody can see them. Everybody's ready to compete with them. And nobody, most of the Chinese entities, are not afraid to start that same business today in China. So if you're going to go, go. Otherwise, it's too difficult to play catch-up. Where Hong Kong still has relevance at all in the China discussion is as a monetization tool, because there's no doubt, rather than having to finance companies today in the standard venture capital mode from Silicon Valley of raise at progressively higher valuations, you can reverse yourself into a listed company in Hong Kong. Hong Kong's one of the most valid exchanges in the world today. It's been a top 3 IPO market for 3 out of the last 6 years or something like that. And you know, whether you're IPOing or whether you're RTOing or whether you're being acquired by a listco, you can do very serious monetizations to give yourself the chance to continue growing your business in the Hong Kong marketplace. Only if you're a domestic entity can you take advantage of the Chinese marketplace, but that's where Hong Kong's still very valid.
Okay, so you said earlier that Southeast Asia has become a legitimate market. Why do you say that?
When we have a history of speaking to investors and looking at certain situations over the last 10 years. And 5 years ago, when we tried to look at financing the Lazadas of the world and companies like that were emerging, the big hesitation from professional investment capital was, oh, it's too difficult. It's impossible to grow in 5 different markets at the same time. It'll strain management. The cultures are different. The languages are different. The logistics are different, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. These, again, are issues that I think are important, but they have too long of a shelf life. Plenty of entrepreneurial minds are attacking the Southeast Asian market and doing that in a multi-country sense. And I think getting the valuations and raising the financial dollars to prove that many others in the world believe this is a legitimate effort. So to me, Southeast Asia has formed itself as a regional bloc to attack. And as Keelok said a minute ago, there's China, there's India, and there's that market in between, which I think we're calling Southeast Asia. Could there be more of an Indonesian emphasis, or Vietnamese, or depending on the business at hand? Yes, but it's all in that same block.
Keelok, Vertex has invested in Grab Taxi, which is $1 billion, a unicorn company today in Southeast Asia. What other comments do you have about Southeast Asia as a real market?
I think what Jay says is correct. I agree with him that Southeast Asia is not uniform. So generally, when we start a company, we look at a company, we try to understand what are you trying to solve, and which is the market that will need their solution the fastest and earliest. So, for example, let's fintech. If you try to launch a fintech in Vietnam, that's the last place you go in Southeast Asia, right? And if you want to do fintech, probably the first place is probably Singapore, next place is Malaysia, next place is probably Indonesia, and in that, probably that in that order. So it depends on the business, and then you need to look at it and decide what makes sense, what you need to do in the execution. And then thereafter form the team, get the right people to roll out step by steps. And a very important point about all these startups in all this region, today the most popular thing is fintech, right? 9 months ago, its most popular thing is hyperlocal and O2O, right? If you come to see any VC and don't have these two terminology, you're out the door. And then if you are 24 months ago, you're talking about marketplace, right? And then you go further ahead, you're talking about e-commerce. So in all these startups tomorrow may not be fintech anymore, could be something else. I don't know what it's going to be. So the point is that in this market, there's always this kind of on-off, hot topics, hot engagement. Yeah.
Thanks. Alex, so Singapore is right in the middle of Southeast Asia. So what do you think, or where do you see Singapore playing a role?
Well, Singapore, like what you say, is right in the middle of all these activities, but fundamentally, Singapore is very small. It's a small island, about 5.4 million populations. in terms of, we really want to look at it, look at the DNA-wise, is that Singapore is a trading hub. So as a trading hub, that we are pretty good in terms of bringing a business in and out of Singapore. So it's almost like in our DNA. So most of the Singapore company, when they first start, we call them born global, which means that within the first 6 months, they will have think of going overseas. It is in a contrast that today, this morning, we just have a YouGov data just released, and I look at the UK startup. Only 48% of you think that you want to go overseas. It's kind of a huge contrast because that for a VC, we are looking at global dominating kind of company to invest in. And if you're only looking at local-wise, it's going to be challenging. But of course, that you understand that the context behind it is that a market that is sufficiently big and is comfortable for a while, the desire to go overseas is not. But for Singapore, it's very different. So the DNA-wise is that you kind of push our startup to born global and start going out. And for most of the overseas companies that come in, they also know that using Singapore as this springboard. So what kind of thing, what kind of environment does a company need in terms of springboard? Which also I cite the same YouGov data is that the very first one they're looking at is ease of doing business. So Singapore, practically you can register a company within 20 minutes online, just like that. Good infrastructure. We right now have fiber to the home. That means that almost all the home will have connectivity. On the average, the house is having about 100 meg in terms of bandwidth. Companies in terms of corporate is still a little bit lower because that adoption for the business is still a little bit lower to start with. Last but not least is that the regulations and the ability for the regulator to work together with the company for innovation. Something that we are doing, especially on the fintech front, is that we start working on the regulation sandbox. A sandbox allows some form of innovation within the regulation that we want to experiment and see whether such thing is possible now. So a couple of all these three things, which is what the company will go global who are needed. So I think Singapore positions ourselves is quite well as a springboard for the company to come in and expand to Southeast Asia.
Thanks. Neil, corporate innovation. You have, 2,000 bank staff that have gone through your innovation programs?
Yeah.
What have been the benefit, the real benefit to the bank?
So the big thing, we put 10% of the staff through there. Our top 250 leaders, we got them all to create fintech companies. That was fun. Most of them failed. We got 8 left. The biggest benefit is creating two things. One is creating that excitement inside the organization that we're on a journey of change, that we're no longer working in a bank, we're working more in a tech company. And just the simplest thing, once we put them through a hackathon, or they've been a mentor and accelerator, or they started their own fintech business and failed, or whether we got them to run lean startup experiments, or build computer games, or build robots, or whatever we've done with them, that they just go back to their desk and they go, hey, I've got a project to start, and I'm going to do it a bit differently. That's all we want from them, is just to put a bit more kind of science care, have things like customer centricity, design thinking behind that. They start to think like a startup, and then we want them to think about platforms. So, and collaboration. So collaboration inside the bank, and then collaboration with external ecosystems, and have those ecosystems ready for them. So no longer do we feel like, as banks generally just build all their own stuff, that they can reach out, they can plug into these ecosystems, co-invent, and just do it differently, do it quicker, and do it smarter, and really focus on the customer life. A lot of banks, they just push product. They go, hey, this customer needs a mortgage. No, they don't. This customer's just had a baby. They need to get a bigger house because they need more rooms. And that's what the customer's thinking. As a bank, generally we just go, right, need mortgage. So we're trying to reinvent ourselves before the disruption forces reinvention on us.
But how is that impacting hiring in the bank?
It's changed a lot, actually. We've got a lot, actually, our churn's down, so our staff churn's reduced a bit, and we're getting more tech company people want to come work for DBS. There's very exciting projects that we're running at the moment. The fact that bank staff now, I think we're one of the first companies in the world, we actually push them out of the bank and we put them in an accelerator to start their own companies. So we have an innovation sabbatical for 3 months. You can leave the bank. You're not allowed to dress like a banker. and you sit in a facility and you own the IP. We don't, as a bank, we don't own anything. We don't want equity. We're one of the most profitable banks on the planet. But we want these staff to go out and feel like that if you're an entrepreneur, you can have a career at our bank, and then you can go on and create your own startup. And we've looked at how we reinvented training, we've reinvented finance, we're doing legal, compliance, procurement, so we can work better with startups. But we want to really get that culture of a tech company. So be more experimental, be more customer-centric, move at pace and break things, use things like lean startup. And then we hope over time that we're going to get less bank people working for us, ideally.
Right. I'd like to open questions to the floor. Are there anyone who would like to ask questions? No? Okay, just as the last round, guys, can we talk about what kind of advice would you give to companies who want to start up in Asia or use Asia as a place to do their disruptive technology? Jay?
There's a lot of advice to give, but I think when you're meeting a group that's already formed its team, picked its product, established its technological path, the best thing that we can do is just provide quote-unquote advice that is both technical in nature as well as strategic. I think, as founders are being challenged to grow successfully in Asia, they need help, right? And we see the governments scrambling to try to create the right programs. We see venture capital groups, ours included, getting more bodies on the ground and capabilities on the ground. And ultimately, it's going to be the ecosystem that lifts all boats, with the tide. And we're trying to be equipped with this huge expanse called Asia to be able to provide both. Not just contacts here and there around the world, but technical advice, strategic advice, and really just trying to partner with a select group of startups with a full gamut of capabilities and input. That's probably going to be the most helpful to them.
Neil?
Bring shorts. The weather's lovely. It's nice and warm. No, I'm joking. It's a few things. One is partner. Don't come in and think that just because this worked in Europe or the US, it's going to work in Asia. The great thing about Asia, there's a lot of white space. There's a lot of gaps you can play into, especially around demographic. So we got the fastest growing middle class on the planet in many countries. You can follow the middle class demographic. Yeah, we've got people leapfrogging the internet and going straight to mobile. We've got the highest concentration of Twitter users on the planet in Indonesia. You can follow the social media demographic. So there's huge demographics that are being under-monetized across Asia, where in Europe and the US, all the startups fully understand this and they jump on it. So come in, sell up in a place where your IP is safe. Somewhere like Singapore, where there's good funding, great access. Look at smart partnerships and try and ride some of the massive, ginormous demographics that you're seeing in these countries. Stuff like women working in Indonesia. There's tens of billions of dollars in that thing. Play the demographic and and learn. There's a lot to learn in Asia.
Alex?
Well, I'm just going to write on what Neil said is that the market is huge, but this is very different. So in most of the ASEAN city, big city, it appears just like any Western city, but underlying the culture, everything is different. So my recommendation is always that immerse in the place. Okay, just experience it. You have to be immersed inside down there and adapt. But most importantly, go ask for help. It's a lot of the time we encounter a lot of startups is trying to do everything themselves. And they are afraid of asking. They do not know whether there's some cultural taboo or whatever there is. Most of the Asians, okay, we were very, very happy to just help you along. So just ask for help. If you ask, chances are you will get it.
Kilo?
I guess don't try to be another copycat and don't try to be another Me Too. There's enough of them everywhere in the world. I think ultimately you have to ask yourself, what are you trying to solve? What is the pain point? There's enough white space in Asia, that enough issues to be solved. I think if you are smart enough to figure out what is the pain point and ask yourself, is that painful enough for most people? If it's painful enough, this is a big market, and and then build a company around it to solve it.
Okay, one last one, I was wrong. Is there an area or a market that's waiting to be solved? Would you stick your neck out? Jay?
Well, I think there's still a lot of problems to be solved, and you kind of hear that in the trail of answers, that if Asian startups can really be not deferential to the incumbent system of regulations and corporates and just really solve problems, even if they're bumping up against the system, that's a very encouraging thing. In terms of a geography that we think is exciting, you know, if I had to target something, I would say China, of course, but Indonesia, a little bit closer to home for us. We like the population there, the demographic, and we think there's a lot of very productive activity on the ground. So that's what I'd point out as a good region.
Neil?
Yeah, I mean, it has to be a banking one. Absolutely go after the underserved in banking. Go, you know, these people today where they don't have formal banking services all have mobile phones. A lot of them smartphones, believe it or not, coming out of China. Things are dirt cheap. One day they're going to be the middle class, one day soon. Get in there, own that market. There's huge amounts of money to be made in the fintech. You know, there's literally, you could sweep up like, I don't know, 500 million to 1 billion people in that thing. And create a ginormous underserved banking market.
Yeah.
Alex?
Well, in the smart nation context, we are looking at two things. One is aging population, the other one is urban mobility. I think urban mobility opportunity in Asia is actually very big because in most of the Asian cities, there's a traffic jam is pretty bad. If we're able to move the people from point A to point B seamlessly, cutting off the number of hours they spend on transport, that will save a lot of things. Yeah.
Kilo?
I guess for us, today the most popular thing is fintech, so you have to always look at it. But if we look longer term, I think the big industry that have not really been disrupted, besides the telco, the banks, the next one is utility.
Sorry, what?
Utility.
Utility.
Utilities, I think, is the next sector which information technology had not really disrupted them yet. So the question is, what is that disruption going to come? Is it in the form of first utility in the UK, which are creating a very interesting model? So what is that in Asia? How does it look like? Especially Asia, in most countries, doesn't really produce its own oil. So what is that model? So that would be interesting.
Okay.
Anyway.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Appreciate your time, and thank you for listening to us this afternoon.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.